in the Labour Party 25 points ahead of the Tories. Let's check in with Sir John Curtice, polling expert and Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. John, hello there.
Good morning to you.
Thank you for being with us. Is the NHS, I'm just looking at some polling here on NHS waiting times. 84% believing that Rishi Sunak is handling that badly. 5% thinking that the government is doing well on that issue. He has a heck of a tanker to turn around there, doesn't he?
He does. And of course, the problem is, and this is a problem we'll face any government for the next few years, is that while the public services aren't working, particularly the health service, because of the very long waiting times and staff shortages, we know that the government's already pretty much maxed out its credit card. Indeed, one of the things that came out last week was that now government borrowing is slightly more than the size of the UK economy, and how governments are going to succeed in turning the public service around without, frankly, having much opportunity to spend much more on them is one of the challenges. Yes, it faces this government, but it's probably going to be bequeathed to whoever is also running the government after the general election.
We've sort of been broadly assessing Rishi Sunak's chances, given that polling that we had yesterday, the Labour Party 25 points ahead. Stephen Swinford described Rishi Sunak's path in the Times on Saturday to electoral victory as millimetres wide. Is he right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that the government will be disappointed about is that the progress, such as it was, which was fairly minimal, that the Conservatives have been making in the polls in closing the gap on Labour, a lot of that has been reversed. Now, you're right, the YouGov poll indeed had the lead at 25 points. A couple of other polls also coming out recently, also showing the lead widening. If you actually take the average of all of the polls that have been conducted since the announcement by the Privileges Committee of its verdict on Boris Johnson, the gap's not quite so wide in all of them, and not quite all of them has seen the lead widen. But we're certainly at the moment looking at average of around a 19-point lead for Labour in the polls, whereas if you go back to the beginning of this month, it was only running at 15 points. And 19 points is not much below what it was when Mr. Sunak became Prime Minister back in October. So certainly a reverse for the Conservatives. I think a couple of reasons as to why this is probably going on. One, of course, is the fact that the bad news on interest rates is particularly bad news for those who have a mortgage. And Opinion last night put out some interesting analysis showing that indeed, at least since the middle of April, the swing against the Conservatives has certainly been greater amongst mortgage holders than those also who are renting. They're just amongst those who are owning outright. So the darkened economic climate is one thing. The other thing is I would point to, because it does look as though the decline in the Conservative position, the increase in the Conservatives, can at least be dated from around the time that the Privileges Committee came out with its report, is that it may well be that Mr. Sunak has misjudged things in the way in which he's handled that, and that he didn't take the opportunity to distance himself from Boris Johnson to a greater extent than he actually did, and that this is a deeply emotional issue for a lot of people. That publicity reminded them of what they thought about Boris Johnson and Partygate, and Mr. Sunak perhaps is now paying the price for example, not turning up in the House of Commons and voting for the Privileges Committee report.
Very interesting. Let's talk about Humza Yousaf, because he's also got a challenge ahead, a tanker of sorts, potentially. Trying to sort of hit reset on independence with the SNP this weekend. How are the numbers looking for him?
Well, so far as the numbers are concerned, I think, the reason why he is now opting for the idea that, we think that winning most of the Westminster seats will be a way of saying to the UK government, Scotland wants independence, so can we either start negotiating or at least have a referendum? It's that at the moment the SNP, even if you also take into account the other smaller pro-independence parties, they're a long way off the 50% mark that Nicola Sturgeon set for them. So that, if you take the average of the polls that have been conducted since the beginning of April, when Mr. Murrell, Nicola Sturgeon's husband, was arrested, you're looking at the SNP at around 37%, only 6 points ahead of Labour, but still enough to get most seats. But there was a poll in the Sunday Times last Sunday from Panel Base that actually put the two parties neck and neck, 34 each, and in those circumstances, Mr. Yousaf's revised target for his not quite de facto referendum would not be met. The Labour Party would end up with most seats in those circumstances. So the SNP cannot be sure of meeting their target, given some of the recent polling. And certainly, the one obvious reason, why they are now not talking about getting 50% of the vote is that while support for independence is still running at 48%, the SNP themselves are no longer commanding the loyalty of yes voters to the same extent that they were a couple of years ago.
All right, it's really, really interesting. John, thank you for your time this morning. Always nice to catch up. Thank you. So John Curtice, polling expert and Professor of Politics. Oh, there he goes. At the University, off to the next one probably, at the University of Strathclyde with us on Times Radio Breakfast.
After the news.